다른데, 통만들이야. 아주, 대재미 지주.
First of all, today,
아주,
I would like to extend my warm greetings to all of the Kempo's teachers and geshes and as well as all the nuns who are attending the spring teachings, as well as to all of my friends who are listening over the internet. So I would like to wish you a warm greetings.
다들인데야, 까마봐. 군주인게 보면 유도지기. 남달.
So today we're discussing the autobiographical verses Good Deeds by Mikyo Dorje, and within this we will be speaking about the 23rd and the 24th and the 25th good deeds. I thought we could speak about all three of these today. Now, according to the outline from Sanjay Paldrup's commentary on the meaning of this text, and we don't need to go through all of the entire outline, but right now we are discussing how he practiced the path of the greater individual. And this has three topics. The first is the intention of arousing bodhicitta, the second, the action of meditating on the two types of bodhicitta, and the third, how he trained on the third precepts of the two types of bodhicitta. So of the three, right now, we're speaking about the third of them, how he trained in the precepts. Now, how the train in the precepts has 7 different subtopics. And I don't need to read each of them, but among these 7 topics, we're speaking about how he trained in the 6 transcendences. Now, this has 6 subtopics. Now, because there are 6 transcendences, there would be 6 subtopics, right? Now, there's 6 subtopics, but only 5 of them are taught here because transcendent prajna is contained within the ultimate bodhicitta we discussed the other day. So there are discussions of the 5 of the transcendences. And so yesterday we spoke about the first of these, transcendent generosity. So what I'll begin by speaking about today is the second transcendence, the transcendent discipline. Now, in this text on how he trained in discipline, the root text reads, "For virtuous actions such as offering and giving to become causes of perfect Buddhahood, they must be guided along the path by the fine ways of virtue. I acted in harmony with the codes the Buddha taught. I think of this as one of my good deeds." So this is the verse about training in transcendent discipline. And so in the terms of the 33 good deeds, this is the 23rd of the good deeds. It is the 23rd of the good deeds. Now, in Mikyo Dorje's collected works, there is a text called The Instructions in Training in Mikyo Dorje's Liberation Story. And I thought I would first begin by speaking about the passages in that text that are related with this first. Now, the main point here, as I said the other day, is to talk about the basis for disputes, or the main cause for difficulties in the world, for problems in the world, is is our possessions, wealth, and possessions, wealth, and resources, and so forth. If you are completely free of attachment, it is very important for us to be free of attachment to these roots of disposal, these sensory pleasures, or to, if we should not grasp them as being a self, if we are not free of attachment to them as either a self or as mine, then the problem that happens is that because of either getting or not getting the material things of the Dharma that we want, we have the greed of thinking, oh, maybe I can get those again. And if we don't get them, then you might have the hatred. And so there's the danger that greed and hatred will arise. And if greed and hatred arise, then what happens that all the faults that go against distant come out of this greed and hatred. So for this reason, as long as we have the wish that we're going to benefit other sentient beings or the intention to help other sentient beings, and whenever there's any opportunity to do so, you should never in any situation seek your own physical comfort or your own mental comfort or so forth, or your own benefit in any way. Instead, like those Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who have come under the control of others, you should never try to build yourself up or expect in any response. So becoming like this is extremely important, he says. So in order for this to happen, as I mentioned before, we must have no attachment for sensory pleasures, and we should have no attachment to them at all. We should have no fixation on them, and we should not consider them to be a self, to be mine. And if we are able to become free of such attachment, then whether we're practicing the Bodhisattva's discipline of refraining from misdeeds or the discipline of gathering virtuous qualities, then we'll be able to practice all the discipline of a bodhisattva. So this is what it says in Mikkyō Dorji's instructions on training and Mikkyō Dorji's liberation story. And now, what is described in Sanjay Peldrup's commentary on the meaning of the good deeds, what is described in relation to this verse is that quite a number of people, when you look at it from the outside, seem to spend their time in being generous, or they seem to be practice discipline. It seems like they spend their entire life practicing the roots of virtue. And so it seems like this. There's the appearance that they're acting in this way, but in actuality, when you really look at it, the way that they're actually practicing them is, and are they really practicing in a way that accords with the Dharma, that fits with the Dharma? Then it is not. In one place, they're not practicing that. And the reason, because they're not able to do that. And so because they're not able to practice, then what they do is they say that, and so they don't have the ability to practice, practice the teachings without going against the Dharma. And so they make many excuses. Now, one of them that says is that you have the three types of vows. You have the vows of the deliberation, the Bodhisattva vows, and the Tantra vows. And when you're discussing about how you should keep them, when a single individual has all three of them, how should you decide what to do and what not to do? And so what they say is that the qualities of the higher vows apply, and they outshine any faults or offenses. They overwhelm all the faults of any transgressions of the lower ones. In other words, what they're saying, if you are unable to keep the lower vows, but you keep the higher vows, then that overwhelms the faults of the offenses of the lower vows. And also, there are many transgressions of the prohibitions in the Vinaya, the foundation vehicle. they say you should turn away from them, but even if you don't, that if you and they don't turn away from them, and then in addition, they commit many offenses that violate their discipline. And what they say is that they say if there's a conflict in the vows, then the higher one prevails. You have the three vows, the vow of individual liberation, the vow of the bodhisattva, and the vows of mantra. And sometimes when you're keeping them, there are like some conflicts between the two, or some place where you have to make a choice. And when that happens, the one that you should choose, as they say, is that the higher vows is more important. So you should primarily practice the low one and not the lower. It's the lower one is not the primary one. This is what is often said, and so they use this as an expense. They misunderstand it, and they engage in activities that ruin themselves and others. And so this topic comes up in the discussion of the three vows, and I don't need to say too much about it today. But in brief, the practice of the three vows is important from one perspective, is important for all of us Buddhists, and it is especially important in our Tibetan Buddhism. And the reason for this is that Tibetan Buddhism is different than other lineages of Buddhism. And because we say that we practice the foundation vehicle Mahayana and Vajrayana all completely and without mistakes. And when we try to practice all three vehicles completely and without mistake, when you think about how to do this in the context of a single individual, then there are some real points about how to keep. There are some big issues in terms of determining what you should do and what you should not do. And so for this reason, in the olden times in Tibet, many of the great masters of the past and many scholars, they paid a lot of attention to the three types of views. For example, the most well-known treatise on the three vows is the explanation of the three vows by Sakya Pandita. Also in the Nyingma tradition, there is a text on the three vows that is a well-known text by Ngari Panchen. In the Gelugpa tradition, there is a text by Kedub Chan, the three vows, and in the Kagyu tradition, we also consider the three vows to be particularly important. For example, in the Taklung tradition, there's the Taklung three vows. That's considered a particular feature of the Taklung tradition. In the Kamsan tradition, we also have later many three vows on the three vows, such as one by Ngari Panchen. But there are also other texts on the complete texts on the three vows, and so there are several of different texts like this. And when we read these, we can see that all the master of the past and can understand that master of the past considered the three vows to be extremely important and very significant. In particular, we need to recognize what the essence of the three vows and what the types of the three vows are. There are a lot of discussion about what they were between different discussions. And there are some differences in the descriptions in the different traditions. So these are something that is very important for us to pay attention, because otherwise we might say that Tibetan Buddhism is really important. It's different from others. As we say, we practice the greater vehicle, foundation vehicle, and Vajrayana. We said this is the actual what we do, and we speak about it very impressively, but actually the practice of the three vehicles, when we get to the point of the actual practicing it, in the way it looks on the outside, it seems like there's some real places where there are discordances between the practices, and there are many different divisions and different conflicts between them. And so If we do not understand the actual point that's behind this, then we can develop wrong views and misconceptions, or we can make incorrect choices about what we should do and what we should not do. But if we think about someone like Mikyo Dorje, what he did is that he had students who were able to practice the vows and precepts from the foundation vehicle and who could really bear this burden of practicing the Vinaya. And so for them, he taught them the precepts, the practices of the foundation vehicle. There are also some students who are able to bear a burden of the bodhisattva practice, and who were able to do the practice of a bodhisattva, and he taught them the precepts of the bodhisattva vehicle. There are also a few vehicles who were able to bear the burden of the Vajrayana teachings, the secret mantra Vajrayana. And so he taught them the conduct of the Vajrayana that's taught in the Indian texts and the Tantras and so forth. In other words, he taught each individual according to the degree of how sharp their faculties or the degree to which they gather the accumulations. And the question of what the level of their antidote, the quality of the antidote in their beings were. And so he gave them the instructions on what to do and what not to do, and the points about the practice according to their own level. He would not teach someone who is unable to bear the burden to keep the precepts of the Bodhisattva vow. He wouldn't make them take the Bodhisattva vow. If there's someone who is unable to practice the Vajrayana and keep the precepts of the Vajrayana, he wouldn't say, this is really important, you must practice, and to give them the vows and give them a burden that they were unable to practice. And so the way he treated them was just like the way a wise mother raises her dear children. If you've got a loving mother and who has a lot of experience and who has a lot of intelligence, when she's raising her children, she's very gradual about it. At the beginning, the child can't eat solid food, and so the first mother gives them milk, and then gives the child soft foods. Foods that isn't too hard, and gives foods that are kind of mushy, and then they gradually introduce them to the foods that adults normally eat. So this is how a mother will do it. It's not at the very beginning that if you give an adult's food to a baby at the very beginning, the child is unable to digest it, and there's a danger from that, right? So similarly, Mikyo Dorje taught according to the level of a student's continuum, and would direct them in accord with that. That's how Mikyo Dorje did it. Likewise, there are a few yogis who had the vows of the individual liberation, the bodhisattva, and tantra. So there are some yogis who are able to practice the three vows of individual liberation, bodhisattva, and tantra, and who could hold them. And so until they're able to transform their own and others' perceptions, he didn't allow them to engage in conduct that violates the other vows. So you have all three types of vows, the individual liberation, bodhisattva, and tantra. And so when we talk about the three vows, the highest vow is the tantra. And so for those individuals who had such vows, until they were able to transform their others and others' perceptions or until they achieved superior realization, he didn't allow them to do any action that violated the individual vision. You might say, I have the higher vows, so I can't do the lower vows. It's okay for me to transgress those because the qualities of the higher overwhelm the lower. There's no question of that, no talk about that. Until they had the high qualities and realization, he didn't allow them to engage in activities that violated the lower vows. So in other words, you can't use benefiting others as an excuse when you're unable to actually benefit others, and to and he thus prevented them from doing anything that would actually harm oneself and others. And this is very clear and he speaks about this very forcefully in all the instructions that he gives. And you say, I'm going to do something to benefit others. I'm going to treat others. And you use that as an excuse to harm oneself and others, or to increase one's own greeds and attachments and aversions. He said, there's no point to this, no benefit to that. It's to say that you're going to benefit others when it is not yet time to benefit others, and then to do various things to cover the earth and sky and to do all sorts of different things. He said there's no point in doing that. So basically, they're the beginners and they're yogas, and they're siddhas, and they're Buddhas. So basically, they're like the first you're a beginner, then you become a yogi, and then you achieve siddha, become a siddhi, then you achieve Buddhahood, right? So if the ones at the lower stages practice those for the higher stages, there's a real danger. It'll become an obstacle to practicing the path. This is often said, right? It's okay for a beginner to act like a yogi, and for a yogi to do the practice of, you have to come to the level of yoga and have the realization of yoga. Before that, you can't practice like do that. Likewise, becoming a siddha or achieving accomplishment means when you have really achieved accomplishment or siddha within your own being. If you don't have such qualities of liberation and realization, and pretend that you have such a siddhi, then that's not okay to pretend to act like a siddhi. So if those on the lower levels, before they've achieved the higher levels, through the practice of the higher levels, or the conduct of the higher levels, then it becomes an obstacle on their practice. And naturally, they're unable to develop the qualities of the higher levels in their practice, but they pretend to do the conduct of the higher levels. And this prevents them from progressing to the higher levels. And so therefore, all those people who want to practice need to do the practice of the view, meditation, and conduct according to the level of their own being. And so Mikhet Dorje would instruct them in this way. And he'd also teach them and guide them in this way. And Mikhet Dorje is very skilled in doing so, and he took a great interest in doing so. Also, there's no point in trying to say and going to try to do things that you're unable to do. I'm going to say, I keep all the many different things, I'm training different things, I'm keeping many different vows. So we talk about mispractice, misunderstanding. You try pretending to practice something even though you're unable to practice. And if you are unable to accomplish something, then you're unable to keep your vows in your mind. You're unable to do the practice. And because you're unable to do that, you have many violations of the precepts and the vows. And if this happened, then this becomes your own continuing incorrigible, either in this lifetime or in future lives. It makes you into someone who won't be able to be receptive to the Dharma. And so pretending that you're going to be able to practice things you're unable to do things is not helpful. It's not okay to do it. You need to be able to do things that you're able to do and progress, go through progressiveness. You need to look at the level and understand your own level and what your abilities are and practice in that fashion. So Mikhet Dorje always guided his students with great love down the right path, and the way that he taught them was also unmistaken. He taught them gradually in stages according to their own levels. And he thought that it was necessary, and the reason why he taught like this and why it was necessary to teach it this way, had no reason to it. What's the main reason why Mikhet Dorje taught like this? In generally, the great beings, what they understand when they consider things is You need to do something that was really able to definitely benefit you for others. That's definitely going to be of benefit you is to give up harming others and to devote yourself to benefiting others. That is the most helpful thing. That is the one thing that is certainly going to help. So other than giving up harming others and benefiting others, there's nothing that certainly will help us. Great beings understand this from their own experience. If you give up harming others and if you benefit others, then this is definitely going to help you in this lifetime to achieve lasting happiness. They understanding this, because they have this understanding their being, then they direct other people, and so like no choice but to teach the people in the proper way, because they have certainty, they have conviction in it, and so then they have to tell people about it. And so there's no choice for them, but when they're teaching other beings to bring them down the proper path. And there's no choice but to teach them in an unmistaken way, because they have the actual certainty, and because of that certainty, there's absolutely no opportunity for them to teach the wrong path or to teach the path incorrectly. Likewise, there's actually no chance that they would do anything to deceive other, to be like or to fool other people in teaching that, because they understand in order to do this, you need to, they know what you do. And in order to achieve that, they know that you have to give up, in order to achieve the lasting benefit for oneself and others, you have to give up harming others. So they have the certainty of this, and they have the experience of this in their own beings. And so for this reason, they never engage in deceit, guile, or scams when trying to benefit others and bring them to lasting happiness. And so for this reason, in any time and situation, Mikyo Dorje, no matter whom he met, was never deceptive, and he never acted on the worldly concerns. Nor did he ever have any ties of self-interest. He never exhibited any of these. And so because of this, it was like, more generally, people, they have like, we have like, we have like a bit of hypocrisy. Like we pretend to be really good in front of people. But when we're someplace else, when we're in people's, then we do, bad things. We do wrong things. And so it's like a hypocritical. This happens with a lot of people. We're hypocritical, right? The Mikyo Dorje had no hypocrisy. There was never behaved well in front of other people, and never privately where no one could see, acted badly. And because of this, so whether Mikyo Dorje was in the midst of an entourage of 100 people or was all alone, there was actually no difference in how he behaved with his body, speech, and mind, because he had no hypocrisy. So no matter what he did with his body, speech, and mind, there was never any difference. And so because when you have like treating people well or treating people not, so like whether a guru or whether you have another person, whether you had, there was no difference of whether there was a good connection between them or not. There was never better or worse, or influential or insignificant, or being intimate or distant. There was no question of whether they're a friend or not. No question of how much affection they had for each other, or a question of whether they had any enmity or resentment. And no matter what, he was never any different to anyone. He was always completely straightforward with everyone, because he had nothing to hide. And because he had there was no reason for it to discriminate among people. Now, if you have something to hide, then you're going to hide. You're going to treat those who you know better. You're going to treat them better, and those you don't know, you're going to have a different expression toward them. If there are people who have confusion, then you're going to talk about them. But those people who don't believe in you, or the people you don't have much confidence, you're not going to say much of them. But there was none of that with Mikyo Dorje. And because of this, Mikyo Dorje was he was like, he was never altered attitude, never changed speech, never disguised independence. There was no difference. He never changed in the way he acted. There was in the way he acted with his body. There's no difference with his speech. He never changed his speech when he was in front of people or not. And he never disguised his intentions. So he never had any suspicions or reservations, never kept, whatever he said, he just said it directly. So for that reason, when someone else would come to meet Mikyo Dorje, there's no reason to be careful or apprehensive about him, because he's just like completely straightforward. He was straightforward, so for other people to be careful or to worry and be apprehensive it might offend him, or there's no need to worry about that. And so for this reason, many people, when they met Mikyo Dorje, they said, this guru is really different from anyone else. They were really amazed, and they immediately started to feel faith in him. Likewise, Mikyo Dorje himself had no new faults or mistakes that he hide or any secrets he had to keep. Most of us, we had things that, if someone knew this, if I something I have to hide this. We have things that we want to keep private. This comes about with us, right? But Mikyo Dorje had nothing like that. And Mikyo Dorje himself had very few afflictions, very small. He never had much many thoughts of greed or hatred. And he really understood that everything that appears is like the play of illusion. He realized that no matter what happened, he realized that appearances are like illusions. So he always spent his time acting like a small child. If you looked at him from outside, it'd be like a child. Because children don't really worry about how people look. They don't really pay much attention to any people. They just go through how things appear to them, right? And like a little child, he didn't have a lot of attachment or hatred like adults do. So for that, when we look at when Mikyo Dorje did things, he did them the same way that a little child would do them. He didn't have a lot of afflictions in his mind. And he saw that he realized that everything is a play of illusion, that all appearances are illusory. And so because of this, he spent his time acting in this way. Likewise, whoever in his people in the entourage would meet him, whether they're high or low, he never had the thought, this one has done this unwholesome act or done this offense. He never had anything like that he had to keep him. And no one had ever heard him say anything like that. And so for this reason, for this reason, the more you knew him, the greater your belief and faith became. It's like we say in Tibet. It's like you say, we often talk about him that you should just speak, you just say what immediately we think. If you need to get to know someone, you should look at them immediately. The first time you meet them, it's like your first impression of them. These are really important, right? When you look at them, the first impression, you can basically know the person from that. Or you can say the first word, best word. Or you get to know them for 3 days. And at that point, you can basically know what the person is like, right? Yeah, that's either on the first impression or after 3 days, you can know what someone's like. So basically, the more you got to know Mikyo Dorje, the more you became familiar with him, then you could really have greater belief in him, understand that he's different from other people and have greater faith. And this is something that everyone could see. It was kind of like a common perception that everyone had. So basically, in brief, Mikyo Dorje had no mistakes or regrets about his body, speech, and mind, or anything to be ashamed of. And so he had no things. Oh, I have to be careful. I need to have anything to hide or any caution, any suspicions. If you've got some sort of fault, then you feel you have to hide it. Feel like you need to be cautious about it. But he had nothing like that at all. It's like the Buddha, there are three ways in which Buddhists have nothing to hide. It was similar with Mikyo Dorji, it seemed, to a lot of people, as his students would say. Likewise, another feature, you could think this is like a particular feature of Mikyo Dorji's own example. It's like he had nothing to hide. There was nothing that he had to worry. He had nothing to be suspicious or to hide. He was just like obvious who it was, in the front of everyone. Likewise, he also really direct and say, this is your fault, this is your sensei, this is an offense. He would just say it directly. He would point out that a fault is a fault, and he'd eliminate their faults. And then in this place, so you need to accomplish this equality, and then he'd get them to accomplish their faults. And so he was able to directly show students what the faults are and what the qualities are. In the sense of having nothing nothing irreproachable or nothing nothing to hide, and so then be having any faults, and so because of that he was able to point it out directly to other beings what their faults are and how they need to accomplish it. If you aren't like that, it's difficult to say to other people. Either you have to have no faults yourself, or either you have to have the fault. Either you pretend that you don't have the faults and kind of pretend that you don't. It's like Drupal Kunle talked about this once. Drupal Kunle once said, some people asked him, please teach us Dharma. And when they said, please teach us the Dharma, what Drupal Kunle said was, teaching Dharma isn't easy. To teach Dharma, either you have to know faults, either that or you have to be on either have no faults or you have to have faults but still teach it anyways out of audacity. So I'm not like that. I don't have the audacity and I don't have no faults. So in another case, you have to have the confidence that you have worked at that you have freed yourself of the influences that would cause you to act upon non-virtuous actions. And no matter how virtuous of your virtuous acts and intentions are, you have to have the good behavior, the virtuous behavior yourself. And you need to make it so that the positive virtuous qualities naturally increase. And you need to spend your time associating only with people who practice virtuously, and this will naturally occur. Otherwise, if you have many faults, but at that same time that you have many afflictions, and if you teach other people how to sever to stop doing offense, then this is like fruitless activity. So at this point, what I thought I'd like to speak about next is the sixth stanza from the praise he searched thoroughly, because this is really closely related. So in the praise he searched thoroughly, I think I taught through the fifth stanza last year, so now we've come to the point where we need to start from the sixth stanza. And so what this sixth stanza reads is, And the reason why it's so very closely related is described in the annotated commentary by the fifth Shamrazanid commentary. And this gives an outline of this. And if we go by that, then it says that this stands and teaches the discipline of not giving into the afflictions and the dhyana of suppressing the afflictions. So I think that they're talking about at this point in relation with this good deeds. Now, what this verse says is, he never gave afflictions or evil thoughts a moment's chance and built a dam of antidotes in case they arose. Never letting go of the good ways of virtue, he was a friend who brought benefit to him, my prayer. Now, this praise, he searched there, please, is a little bit difficult to understand. So to give a brief gloss of the words. So he never gave afflictions or evil thoughts a moment's chance. So if there's an affliction such as hatred were to arise, then he would build like a dam out of loving kindness. When we talk about a dam, the reason why I say it a dam, we should understand it's like a dam or like a dike. We have a Tibetan saying, before the flood comes, you need to build the dike. So you have to build the dike before the flood comes, because once it's come, you can't build the dike. So before the flood comes, you need to build a dike before it arrives in order to prevent the danger. So you first have to build the dike, build a wall, and so if we mean by a dam, we also mean like a dike. When it said never letting go of the good ways of virtue means, so the ways of virtue means like having a conscience, being modest and so forth. And this means never giving up on them. When it says he was a friend who brought benefit to him, I pray, it means you have to supplicate the spiritual friend who brings benefit to others. This is what it means. This is like the basic meaning of the text. Now, to speak about it in slightly more detail, the main structure of the biography of Mikyo Dorje found in Paul's Trungwa's Feast for the Scholars is actually this text, the Praise and Search Therapy. And so what it says at this point in the commentary given in the Feast for Scholars by Paul Trungwa, so any action that is conditioned by a motivation of the three poisons will only bring an entirely negative result, a bad result. So these are solely non-virtuous. If they're motivated by the three poisons, like greed or hatred, so whatever action motivated by those three poisons is only non-virtue. It cannot be virtuous. So even when the greed, hatred, and delusion are not obvious, when you do any action, if you're doing a virtuous or active motivation for this life, you might not be able to see the greed, hatred, and delusion. But if your motivations for this life, then this is not true dharma. Then this is actually pseudo dharma. The dharma means actually, at the very least, means that it's for the very least something that you're doing for the sake of future lifetimes and future. If you're not thinking about future, the next and future lifetimes, then you're not actually practicing dharma. That's one point. And the third thing is, if you're practicing from a wish for peace for one's own sake, if you have an activity that's motivated, if you're striving at virtue motivated by such a wish, those cannot be cause of achieving the great nirvana, the state of Buddhahood. They become a cause for the temporary nirvana, the state of the arhat, of the listener and Pratyeka Buddha arhats. They cannot be a cause of Buddhahood. So in the case with all these three different types of wrong or lesser inferior intentions are enclosed with this one phrase of afflictions or evil thoughts. when you talk about you never gave afflictions or evil thoughts any moment's chance. So the afflictions and or evil thoughts, this means the wrong intentions, and the wrong intentions includes these that are those that are motivated by the three poisons or thoughts for this lifetime, and the inferior intention means those are motivated by the wish for peace for one's own sake. So Mikyo Dorje himself never let any such wrong or such inferior intentions arise for even an instant. For example, it's like when a bodhisattva is on the verge of awakening to Buddhahood, then the evil Mara will make many different emanations and try to provoke thoughts of desire and anger and malice. It's possible that such thoughts will occur. So that's similarly, when you're a bodhisattva, it's possible that wrong thoughts, afflicted thoughts may occur. But even if they occur, then you need to use to repudiate them with the repudiating and distance yourself from them with a distancing antidote, and completely abandon them with the abandoning antidote. So in other words, the moment that the affliction arises, you must whack it down. So that means that when it arises, when it arises, you must recognize it, and then you need to apply the antidote. And this way, you have to have the dam of the inner. So like before the flood comes, you need to build the dike. You have to prepare that dike before the afflictions occur. And so in brief, the Mikyo Dorje had basically no affliction thoughts, but if in case one did happen, he'd have the antidote dharmas prepared and ready for them. And then it says that he never never let good of the good ways of the virtue. So this means he never let the good ways of virtue of the three vows let go, and he became a good friend to all sentient beings, even those who didn't know him. It's like we talk about with the Buddha. So you have on one side of the Buddha, on the one side, left, right, and left. On the one side, there's a person who is anointing him with sandalwood and massaging it. Another person, the other side, someone's coming and is bringing a axe and is touching him. From the Buddha's own perspective, there's actually no difference between the two. The great equanimity to both of these people. He has no thoughts of attachment or aversion to either of them. He only has thoughts of equanimity. He doesn't have any thoughts of attachment or aversion. For people like us, we couldn't even use this example. Person's massaging with sandalwood and someone who's attacking with a hatchet. You can't even use that. It's the moment someone says slightly bad to you, you immediately get angry. And someone praises you a little bit, then you immediately get happy about it. But for the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, there aren't many such thoughts of attachment or aversion. If someone's massaging you on one side and the other person whacking with the opposite side, there's like no difference. You have the great equanimity, the great equanimity of having no preference or attachment or aversions. And so one's treating me well, I'm going to pray for him. The other one's not doing it. I'm going to turn him. I'm going to get rid of him. You have no thoughts like that for the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So no matter what individual, whether they're helping or whether they're harming you, in response, you benefit them. You never do anything at all to harm them. Basically, there wasn't even a situation where he remained neutral with the body, speech, and mind. He spent his time only doing virtuous things. He never did any things that were pointless. He never wasted his time. It's like you never saw him do them. He was always doing like the 10 Dharma practices or other virtuous activities. And so this is what it says. So this is the meaning of the sixth stanza of Mikyo Dorje's praise to search thoroughly. So here's a good time to take a break. So we'll take a 30-minute break, and then we will continue.
그래서 다들네 퍼진 쪽에 나로네 아니 숨바디 다 쇠발을 넣으시디 임바래.
So now the third of the six transcendences
쇠발을
is
넣으시디.
how he trained in patience.
나로 가르치는
What the root verse says is, in both causes and results, the Buddha's words are easy to practice at first and have a great purpose in the end. Since practice them is not a source of harm, I practice patience towards the Tathagata's teachings. I think of this as one of my good deeds. So this is the 24th of the 33 good deeds. Now, in Bhikkhu Dorje's instructions and training in his liberation story, what it says about this topic is,
지단다 전주 선바티 수기 엔시엔이야 치점기 편 다바이네요.
generally, no matter how much a bodhisattva has helped others, they have no hope for themselves that now that they've helped other beings, and no matter what commitments they had, no matter what they've done, they don't have any expectation that others will celebrate what they've done or any wish for some sort of a response. The reason why they don't have any such feeling is all sentient beings are, by their nature, they're deluded. They're naturally intoxicated by the afflictions. And so for this reason, they aren't able to recognize what was done, and they do not realize they have to repay it. And because of this, it's possible that they might praise you. It's possible that they might also criticize you. Likewise, there are also infinite ways in which sentient beings harm themselves. Of course, they harm other people, but they also have harmed themselves in infinite ways from beginning with samsara. So the more that sentient beings harm the people who hurt them, then the more the bodhisattvas think that for the sake of sentient beings who have not understanding, that have helped me when I have harmed me when I help them, it's really important for bodhisattvas to have this sort of patience of thinking that no matter what they've done, that they must help these other sentient beings. And the reason for this is that bodhisattvas understand that the sentient beings from the very beginningless time have always behaved badly and viciously. And from that whole time, they've never gained even the slightest bit of happiness. And when bodhisattvas think about this, they feel even greater compassion. And there's absolutely no opportunity for them to get angry or to feel hatred because of the sentient beings acting viciously, because they understand the nature of how things are. They understand how things are. So the more vicious and the more harmfully they act, then the more they feel compassion for them and feel like they have the pure intention of thinking, and they must bear the great burden for them. So this is what is said in Bhikkhu Dorje's own instructions on training his liberation story. Now, what it says in Sankhya Paldrip's commentary on the meaning. Now, as I said before, from beginningless times, sentient beings have been controlled by the afflictions. They have no control over themselves. And they commit various different types of misdeeds. particularly beings in degenerate ages, in an age when the 5 degenerations are running rampant. Aberrants in the beginning, they've been habituated to behaving badly from beginningless samsara, and particularly in degenerate ages, when there are a lot of coarse afflictions, then they have great afflictions. The affliction arrives very strongly. So for this reason, no matter what action they do, they only behave wrongly and do what they should not do and don't do what they should. It's difficult for them to do what they should and not do what they would. For what they want to, what they accomplish are the pleasures of samsara, but they call it by the name of spreading the Buddha's teachings. And so they have the misconception that accomplishing the pleasures of samsara is to spreading the teachings, and there are quite a few people who are like this. And so they mistake accomplishing the pleasures of samsara for the spreading the Buddha's teachings, and then they go through many difficulties, and they put up with all the difficulties in order to do this. And when they're undergoing this, then what the people say about them is, "Oh, what a great Lama! Someone with a lot of fortitude, who's really able to be patient, someone who does innumerable hardships to spread the Buddha's teachings." So people praise them for this. Well, what Dorje would say about it is that, or what was Mikyu Dorje's activity like? What Mikyu Dorje would often say himself is that no matter what worldly activity you may do, it's difficult to do at first. It's possible that later you might accomplish some, but even if you do accomplish some, there really aren't many pleasant results. It doesn't have much of a result of happiness. It doesn't bring any result of happiness the way you want it, where you expect them to. They're actually, by nature, they're suffering entirely. And this is the way he often spoke. And the way that, just as he spoke, then he saw that the happinesses of samsara are suffering by nature, or they're unpleasant by nature. And so for this reason, he never thought that they were good or that they were worthwhile. He thought the opposite of that, that is good in the beginning, middle, and end. And he had the great certainty that serving the Buddha's teachings is good in beginning, middle, and end. And so in order to benefit others and spread the teachings, he would patient to the point, even to the point of sacrificing his own life for the sake of accomplishing the Dharma and to spread it to others. For example, because he was patient and forbearing in accomplishing the root of virtue and non-greed, so he was no attachment or craving. Because he was forbearing in accomplishing the root of virtue of non-hatred, he was able to take other people's suffering upon himself. So the ability of taking other suffering on himself, you could say. This is one of his particular qualities. Because he was very patient and forbearing in accomplishing the root of virtue and non-delusion, he was able to distinguish what was and what was not the path, whether it was for achieving the higher states or the path of true excellence or liberation. He knew what was the right path and what was the wrong path. He clearly knew he knew this very clearly, and because of this, he was also able to distinguish what was and what isn't. And because he had tasted the nectar of the Dharma, the Ashtatetra, the Buddha's teachings, because he'd tasted this flavor of the Dharma, and so he felt uncontrollable faith in the Dharma. He had really deep faith within his being and his mind. He had great faith in the Dharma. And so for this reason, he discarded all non-dharmic actions, actions that contradict the Dharma, and he just tossed them away, and he'd never think of accomplishing them. And so for this reason, his examples of life in the Mudge were exactly the way the Buddhas and the great teachers are saying. There was never any non-dharmic action, that you'd never see him do anything like that. And so he was very strict and very careful in practicing what should be done and giving up what should be done according to the Dharma. If there was a pure Dharma that he had passed to do, he was someone who practiced the Dharma purely. So he didn't mix the Dharma and non-Dharma. It wasn't like he wasn't someone who wasn't sure if maybe it's Dharma, maybe it's not Dharma. He was not like that at all. And so for that reason, many people in his entourage had said, it's not right for you to do this. Sometimes you have to do a few worldly things. It's better to pretend to do some Dharma things. They said this out of a good motivation, a wish to help. They thought they were benefiting the beneficiaries. So there are people who would say various things to Karma, but thinking they're wishing to help. And so what they'd say is, oh, Your Holiness, you don't know how to overcome your enemies. You don't know how to protect your friends. You don't know how to accumulate wealth. You don't know how to gather a retinue of students. And if someone else serves you, then you don't have any care about it. He never says, oh, you should. He didn't ever thank them or try to placate them by saying, oh, you served me well. And some people do bad things that harm you, but you never do it in response to eliminate their bad behavior, to punish them. You have no plans for the future. You don't have any ideas about what you're doing. You don't think about what you want to do in the future. And you don't think about the past actions that people have done or whether they've helped you or harmed you in the past. You need to keep those in mind. And so know who's good and who is bad, but you don't keep that in mind at all. It's missing your mind. It's just like there's nothing, you just don't keep anything in your mind. You just don't think about it. It's just like completely empty. It's like there's like an essence of nothing there. It's not like you're someone who is going to be able to think, who has like something oomph to you. And so if you continue to do this, then in the future, there won't be anyone to help you. In the future, you won't have anyone to serve you. No one will treat you well. You'll just end up all alone. And so there's some people who offered opinion. Perhaps they were pretending to be respectful. So the people, whether they're from Uzang or from Kham or from the Kongpa, there are people from other areas who would come. Maybe they're in other schools. There are also people who didn't like Menkyo Dorje. These are people from other schools, you would say. Outsiders, you'd say. You'd say the other parties. And what they'd say is, as Menkyo Dorje, you just can't rely on it either for Dharma or worldly things. You just can't say anything about it. He says he's doing things according to the Dharma, but there's like nothing real thing that you can count on. There's nothing that you can actually say there. And so in this way, a lot of people have criticized him. And so there are many people who came up with, no one would be able to put it up, but they would blame him this way. But Menkyo Dorje never got upset about it. He was never offended. It's kind of like if you give water to someone who's really thirsty, then they're really happy, right? Similarly with Menkyo Dorje, what he needed was exactly that. When other people criticize him, then that's exactly what he wanted. And the reason for this is, as Mikyu Dorje himself said, when these things happened, Mikyu Dorje himself said, if the enemies are delighted and your friends are weeping, then and it's like a sign that you're being expelled from the ranks of people who work for the sake of this life. It's a sign that you're being expelled from this. So it is a sign that you've integrated Dharma into your being, or an indication that you have integrated Dharma into your being. So for this reason, when the teachings are like stars shining at dawn, like when the sun is rising, the stars don't have any light. As the sun rises, the light of the stars gets less and less. So the Buddha's teachings are at this time when they're like the stars in the sky at the dawn, or to be able to is it all possible like a connection that would help infinite beings into the Dharma? So I think it's a sign that you can. And so he was really delighted when people spoke about this. And so that Mikyu Dorje, you can't rely on any of the Dharma or anything, and you can't rely on them for anything. It's like this is a sign of the dedicating Dharma in being this time. It's a time of being expelled from the ranks of people who work for this life. And so he was really happy when this happened. So in brief, Mikyu Dorje when you think about how he practiced his Dharma, I'm going to talk about the Maras who practicing the Dharma. Now, this doesn't mean people who are standing outside the door and they're looking ferocious. It doesn't mean that. So often anyone who prevents you from practicing the Dharma, that's a Mara, right? So those Maras who practice the practice of true Dharma, sometimes they appear as enemies and sometimes they animate themselves as friends. So I can just use it. It's not like it's actually an actual emanation or not, but whether or not. Sometimes you can appear, whether you make an obstacle in the form of an enemy or make an obstacle in the form of a friend, those who make obstacles for this lifetime or impediments to practice the true Dharma are like enemies, emanations of the Maras. And so whether they're actual emanations or not, you can call them by the name of the emanations. These Maras, whether they appear, emanate themselves as enemies or disguise themselves as enemies and threatened you, no matter what they did or deceived or threatened him, is he never gave up on the Dharma. And this sort of an example is really amazing, he said. Because most of us, usually what happens is that when we encounter a few difficulties in this lifetime, we think, oh, I can't do it, I'm not able to do it, and you kind of give up. And if you give up, then the Maras have won. And they've accomplished what they planned to do. And so the Maras have won and you've lost. So no matter how many difficulties we have, no matter how much suffering we have, we don't give up practicing the Dharma. And do not give up on trying to benefit others. And it may look on the outside as if you're experiencing a lot of the hardship and difficulties, but in actuality, you've won. You've defeated the Maras. And so this sort of an example of patience, the patience of not thinking anything of people who harm you, of putting up with suffering, is a sign of integrating the Dharma into your being. And so after this is, I would like to speak about diligence. So among the 6 transcendences, the 4th is diligence. And the root text reads, knowing that weak intentions and actions do not suffice for reaching the vast kayas and the profound Dharmakaya, with body and mind continually for untold eons, I've kept my commitment to achieve the kayas of a Bhagavan. I think that this is one of my good deeds. And so here, at this point, what it says in Mikyu Dorji's instruction and training in his liberation story is, now, as I said before, when we're working for our own and others' sake, or in order to achieve the state of Buddhahood, there are many different dharmas that impede us or harm ourselves and others. And so you need to be able to bear up with them. You need to be able to accept them. In order to achieve Buddhahood, there's no choice but to accept and to the dharmas that harm yourself and prevent you. And you need to be patient with this. And the reason why you must be like this is that if someone harms you, and then you return that with harm, then you have then your behavior has become wrong. You need to benefit all sentient beings, but instead of benefiting others, you harm them. If someone benefits you, you need to benefit them, but instead, if you're practicing doing the bodhisattva practice, you need to benefit them. But if instead you harm each other, then you have got the bodhisattva behavior wrong. And if you've got what the bodhisattva should do and what they should not do wrong, then what happens is that then we were talking about the bodhisattva's discipline of refraining from harmful actions, or the discipline of gathering the virtuous qualities of a bodhisattva, or in terms of achieving the result of perfect Buddha, then it's becoming like an enemy to your own practice. It's like the opposite, exclusive of keeping your, it's contradictory of keeping your bodhisattva vows, keeping the discipline. It's exclusive of achieving the result of Buddhahood. And so for this reason, there's no choice for a bodhisattva but to be forbearing of those who harm them, who and patient with those who impede them in achieving the practicing the Dharma. So when people are, as sentient beings have done vicious or horrible things from the very beginning of time and are really habituated to that, then there are such sentients who have wrong actions and bad intentions. Are like it's basically just as there's no end to space, then there's no end to vicious and terrible sentient beings. And just as there is no end to the sentient being to vicious sentient beings, then in order to benefit them, the bodhisattvas, whether there is no end to the activities of the Buddhas and bodhisattvas. And in order to be able to engage in such limitless activities, in order to be able to engage in such an infinite activity, then the bodhisattvas must know that there are such infinite vicious and savage sentient beings. And in order they must have extreme enthusiasm to be able to benefit such sentient beings. Like great diligence is like the fire at the end.
고래 마도베 셴 직된의 대백이 삼땡이 대화 예세와 잠실라베 차네 에네 상계기 공파 머주부 제세네 웬벤넬 대네
fire at an end of an eon, and so you have to has to burn everything up. It's like you have to burn up the thicket or the wood of laziness. Otherwise, if you want to be able to teach, become attached to the temporary pleasures of worldly and superman meditation, remember, solitude, there's like no way that you can just stay there accomplishing the two profound and vast bodies. You just should not think anything of the difficulties, that is, the fearlessness of being diligent. This is what it says. Now, if we speak about this in terms of Sangye Peldup's commentary on the meaning, so these days, some people misunderstand how it's taught that there are many methods to achieve the Buddhahood. And in particular, in the Secret Mantra, it said that for students of high faculties and sharp faculties can achieve Buddhahood in one lifetime. So it said this. So these people don't understand it, but they have a wrong understanding of the words. They misunderstand the words. And what they think is, we have many different methods. We don't need to undergo through much hardship. If we know that secret point of the secret mantra, then we don't need to be diligent for a long time, and we can just practice it without, and we can awaken in a transcendent state of non-action. And they say these believe these really impressive words. And imagine that they can spend like a transcendent, being this awaken in a transcendent state of non-action. In the state of non-action, they can achieve Buddhahood. But actually, the state of perfect Buddhahood is like having the unimpeded nature of all phenomena as they are and as many as there are. So knowing their nature as they are and knowing their appearance as many ways, so you're having unimpeded knowledge of this. And because of having this, because you have unimpeded knowledge of all phenomena, then they're able to turn the wheel of Dharma without impediment, according with the intentions of all sentient beings and in accordance with the faculties of all sentient beings throughout all space. And the reason why they can turn the wheel of Dharma without impediment is because they have the unimpeded knowledge of all phenomena in their nature. That is why they're able to turn the wheel of Dharma without impediment. And so this was this interconnection of cause and result. And in order to achieve such a perfect interdependence of cause and result, you have to have like the supreme diligence. To achieve the big result, you have to have great diligence. So you have to have extremely great diligence and think that it's not just enough to have that great diligence. It's like you should be able to you'd be able to continue it until you achieve complete and perfect Buddhahood. If you're not able to do that, then you will not be able to achieve perfect Buddhahood. In brief, the number of difficulties you have to go to achieve perfect Buddhahood, and it's really difficult to achieve the state of omniscient wisdom, but they don't understand this. When they talk about practicing the Dharma, they think it's something that's probably pretty easy to do. They think it seems like it's pretty easy to achieve a result. And some people think that they need to subdue their enemies and protect their friends, and they get a little bit tired doing things for this. It's kind of difficult to do this, right? It's a lot of difficulties. They get tired of that. And so they get this kind of like a tiny bit of liberation. Not actual wish for liberation, but just because it's just difficult for the time. They just get a little bit of they get tired of that and they want to go to an empty place and spend a few weeks or a few months staying in results. So there are people who do that, staying in retreat. So there's some people who do this, right? And some people, in order to get food to eat and clothes to wear, they look at the difficulties it takes you. That it's not easy to that because you need to appease a lot of other people. And when you're appeasing everyone else, it's difficult. And so they get really upset and And even if they only have like just kind of, barely adequate food and clothing, they're just getting adequate food and clothing. And so and they feel happy to just stay like that. And they think that they're saying, oh, I'm undergoing austerities to achieve Buddhahood, they say. And then there's some people what it's like for them. In this beginning, they don't have the any wealth or prosperity in this lifetime in the very beginning. And because they didn't have it to begin with, so they had nothing to give up, but instead they give up all the, they didn't have the difficulties of practicing the three dangers of Buddhism. And so they imagine themselves to be yogis who practice non-action. So in the beginning, they don't have any of the plentiful resources of this life to give up. And in worldly lives, they haven't given up anything in terms of in this lifetime. So like there's some complications in practicing the three practices, the teachings and the three trainings. It's not like they're really complicated, but there are some difficult points. And so they give them up and they imagine themselves to be yogis. Now, there are also some people that don't understand even a single point about, what you should do and what you should not do in this lifetime. But they've heard that the clear, aware mind is the meaning of all the Buddhas at 3 times. The ordinary mind, that's the mind. And so they get misled by this clear, aware mind. And then in addition, what they say is, oh, I've realized the intention of all the Buddhas. I've realized the intention of the Buddhas. I've recognized the nature of the mind. I've realized the nature of mind. So I have nothing that I want, and I'm free of any result to achieve. There's no need for me to be diligent anymore. And doing this way, they speak really impressively and are really build themselves up. But the way Mikyo Dorje, he practiced diligence was very different the way these other people are practice diligence. So in actuality, they weren't being diligent. It wasn't actually diligent in terms of it wasn't actual diligence in terms of practicing the Buddha's teachings, but they pretended that it was diligence. But Mikyo Dorje knew that in order to achieve Buddhahood, that a small intention was not. Only having a little excitement was not enough. Having only a little diligence is not enough. You can't achieve Buddhahood in a short time. And in order to achieve Buddhahood, you need to have the vast and numerous causes, such as the means and the prajnaparamita, and that you can't do this just in a partial manner, under partial conditions, or with partial virtue. You have to have this wish to bring all sentient beings to other people. You have to have this unbearable love and the great and pure intention. And it shouldn't be just for just a few days or few months. It has to be until you achieve the essence of enlightenment and until you achieve Buddhahood. So you need to have this great enthusiasm, great pure motivation, and great excitement until you achieve the state of Buddhahood. And you must have the great diligence that never turns back. Likewise, the cause for achieving perfect Buddhahood is the vast accumulation of merit and wisdom, and you must have this. Likewise, you also have the conditions are faith, a longing, and wish for liberation. These also have to be infinite, and there's infinite other conditions. Also must have the virtue of non-greed and the virtue of non-hatred and the virtue of non-criticism. And if you do not accumulate these virtues and other immeasurable quantities, there's no way you can achieve Buddhahood. This is the way you're diligent and to achieve Buddhahood is very different than we normally are. But it's very vast diligence. And the great armor of diligence is just unbreakable in at any time ever. So generally, when we, whether they're talking about the sutras or whether they're talking about Tantra, when we're talking about the methods for achieving Buddhahood, there's a duration for how long it takes. How long do you need to do the, how long do you need to be efforts? How much effort do you have to do to achieve Buddhahood? And when we speak about this, according to the secret mantra, people of the lesser faculties or weaker faculties can achieve reborn in 60 lifetimes, so 60 human lifetimes. If you do not break the precepts of the vows of Tantra, it's not if you just sort of stay there and do nothing. You still, if you want to achieve, you haven't stayed in Tantra. But if you're practicing, taking the basis, you're practicing the secret mantra. If you're taking that as the basis, then it takes 60 lifetimes for those of the dullest faculties to achieve. If they make effort over 60 lifetimes, then they can achieve Buddhahood. If your faculties are slightly sharper, then you can achieve this in 16 lifetimes, it is said. And if you have extremely sharp faculties, then you can achieve Buddhahood in one lifetime, it is said, right? So this is the way it is taught in the secret mantra. Now, according to the Prajnaparamita or the sutras, when they speak about how long it takes to achieve Buddhahood, then it's very difficult in the sutras. You say that it's 3 uncountable eons, and that itself is actually, when we're talking about when it's really fast, those bodhisattvas, the highest faculties, that's the shortest period of time that it takes for them, 3 uncountable eons. And these are taking those bodhisattvas of the highest faculties. Of those the middling or the least faculties, it takes them, in order to achieve that, it might take them 37 or more uncountable eons. So it takes many innumerable eons to gather the 2 accumulations and achieve Buddhahood. Otherwise, it's not said that you can just achieve Buddhahood tomorrow or the next day. So in the sutras, the quickest time in which you can achieve Buddhahood is 3 uncountable eons. And in Buddhahood, in the sutra, the quickest time you can achieve Buddhahood is said to be 1 lifetime. But in the sutras, if someone with the highest faculties thinks, I must achieve Buddhahood, they also there must be precedent. There have to be someone who has already gathered the accumulations. This means that there is someone who have all the cause and conditions and the accumulations of merit and wisdom already within their being from previous lifetimes. They must have gathered a great deal of them in previous lifetimes. So they must have accumulated so much of them in previous lifetimes that they do not need to work so hard in this lifetime, but to get achieve Buddhahood in this lifetime. It doesn't mean that if you have someone who has never accumulated any of the accumulations in previous lifetimes, and who has not assembled the causes and conditions to achieve Buddhahood in the previous lifetimes, then they can't just gather a few accumulations in this lifetime, anew in this lifetime, and achieve Buddhahood. That's extremely difficult. It's because you have to be of sharp faculties. In order to become sharp faculties, then you have to have all the causes that make you into having like the causes. You have to have all the causes and conditions. Without them, you won't become of sharp faculties. In order to gain all the causes that and conditions that produce sharp faculties, and you have to, for many previous lifetimes, you must have gathered the accumulations of merit and wisdom in order to become sharp faculties. This is a really important point that we need to understand. And so, in brief, the main point here is that that achieving Buddhahood is not easy at all. And you have this incredible, inconceivable accumulation of merit and wisdom and purify your obscurations. So what you need to notice, you have to have incredible diligence to this. You have to really intense diligence to do this. The diligence we usually talk about is just as enough. You have to have infinite. You have to have huge diligence, huge and powerful diligence in order to do this.
答对了。
So in brief, achieving the state of Buddhahood, what sort of diligence do you need? How can it be so diligent? To give like an example of this or an illustration, in order for us to understand this, we have to talk about it in brief. If you have like as many volumes of the Dharma as will fill this entire universe with billion realms, so if like the entire universe became this huge library, and within this library, and so like the entire universe is a library filled with Dharma texts. Would you able to be diligent enough to be able to understand the words and meanings of all of these texts? If you don't have such diligence, you can't achieve that. But even if you have such diligence, even that is not you shouldn't think that that's enough to achieve Buddhahood. So another example is that in all the ascensions, in all the 10 directions, in all the different realms in the 10 directions, there are innumerable sentient beings. The one we know in this world, we can understand about how many there are. We don't. But what we're talking about is not just this earth, not this the earth world of this earth, but not only that, but all the sentient beings and all the 10 directions and all the universe of the 10 directions. Is thinking, I'm going to bring them all to Buddhahood. I'm going to give them all happiness. And I'm going to make effort to bring every sentient beings to Buddhahood. Are you able to have that sort of diligence? In this lifetime, we help some people and we benefit some people, and that's difficult. But for the Bodhisattvas, they work to benefit the sentient beings wherever they are throughout, and they want to bring, they think to themselves, I want to bring those sentient beings wherever they are to Buddha. That's the type of excitement and enthusiasm we need to have. In order to have that zest to do this, it's easy to say, it's easy to talk about. If we talk about it in terms of our experience, though, it's not easy at all. You have to have a real enthusiasm about it. And even just having that enthusiasm enough is not really enough. You have to have such enthusiasm, but even that is not enough. Now, the reason why just having that enthusiasm isn't enough is, as I said before, if you like the universe of the Great 3000s was like this entire library, and you think if you're going to I'm going to read every single word of every single volume, you have to have that sort of enthusiasm. But even that sort of enthusiasm alone is not enough. That enthusiasm also, you must, until the ends of all sentient beings, until the end of the Dharma expanse, you must never let that excitement, that enthusiasm diminish. Only if you do that, only then can you achieve Buddhahood. Merely having great diligence and great enthusiasm, you need to be able to continue it, and you need to be able to continue it. And because of this, Mikhail Dorje, if you think about him, at that time in Tibet, there were hundreds of different different philosophical texts and topics of study, and he studied them. And many people think think it would be very difficult to understand it. But Mikhail Dorje didn't appear to have any difficulty in understanding that number of, or studying that number of texts. And Mikhail Dorje said, many tens of thousands of students, and many of these students had good conduct, or they didn't all have good conduct and didn't have good intentions. But when he looked at them, he would still never seem to be exhausted by them or never tired of them. And did he ever let up in his diligence? He never let up. Except for others' sake, he wrote many different texts, and during this time, he had many different obstacles in doing this, but because no matter how many thousands of obstacles occurred, they never put out his, they never dampened his enthusiasm or put him in. So these are just examples. So Mikhail Dorje, in this way, you can see about how and this is something we could take a lesson from his diligence. We need to train in being like that ourselves. If we can do that, then we ourselves are going to have the enthusiasm or the diligence for achieving, but then we can develop this. Now, it's difficult to develop this such a great enthusiasm, great diligence immediately. In order to develop such enthusiasm and diligence, then if we can do this, so we all need to become bodhisattvas in order to become a bodhisattva. It's not easy. Because we talk about the bodhisattvas as heroes, and not everyone's a hero. So a hero is someone who's different from ordinary people. Like 1 in 100, or it's like 1 in 100 to 2 in 1,000. That's the way. So not everyone can be a hero. And so in the same way, they look at the bodhisattvas, the heroes, the reason for this is that they have a courage that is unlike anyone else's, and a compassion and pure intentions that are unlike anyone else's. And this is why they're called bodhisattvas, or heroes of enlightenment. And so it's not easy to become a bodhisattva, and achieving Buddhahood is even less easy than that. And so we need to study them, study and train in this, in training. Now, when we say it's not easy at all, it's not something that we should get discouraged. Oh, it's not easy, it's really difficult. We ordinary people just couldn't possibly do that. And if you think it that way, that itself is laziness. That itself is the laziness of self-deprecation, and that's the worst of laziness. That is the laziness of self-deprecation. Actually, it's something you can accomplish. And we often say about this, all sentient beings are able to achieve Buddhahood, or will achieve this. Able to achieve or will achieve is the same in meaning. All sentient beings have the basis or the foundation for achieving Buddhahood. We all have Buddha nature. Buddha nature is present within the continuum of all sentient beings. The cause of Buddhahood, the Buddha nature is present in all sentient beings. We are able to gather accumulations. We're able to purify misdeeds. And so for that reason, we all have the opportunity or the chance to achieve Buddhahood. But whether we're able to take that opportunity, it really depends on whether we're taking it. If we take the opportunity, then we will achieve it. If you don't take it, then you won't achieve the state of Buddhahood. Now, whether we have Dharma or worldly plans, if you take your opportunities, and if you put effort into it, then whatever the result you want, you can achieve it. For example, thinking about the feminism, so forth, women's rights, women's freedom, or if we're talking about nuns, particular situation, the ability to study the philosophical tradition the same as monks, is that we need to take the opportunity. If we put effort in it, then we can achieve the opportunity. If we don't try and don't put effort into it, we think, oh, there's going to be something, and wait for an opportunity to come. It's difficult. So no matter what you're doing, worldly or dharma, you need to try and put effort into it, then you can. And it's important for us to know that. And the state of Buddhahood is exactly the same. So I think that's probably enough for today, and we will leave it here for now.